Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 46.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards. On today's episode, we talk about what it takes to become a master communicator. There's really three areas that we highlight in today's episode. Number one is mindset, and we spent a lot of time on this in the past. We touch on a few very important points that you don't want to miss. But we spend most of our time talking about the second two, and that's being prepared. And that's not just having a bunch of scripts. It really is about having a robust set of options in order to use at a given time in the actual buying process. And we give you a great opt-in for today's episode, the communication tool, and that's a free download. So make sure you go to the show notes and grab that. Number three is how to apply it. And this is the missing link for most offices. You have this, big long list of things that you might say to somebody, but how do you know when to say it and under what circumstances? How do you know where they are in the buyer's journey, what their psychology is? So this is where the real skill is. This is what we spend most of our time talking about. There's a lot of great stuff in today's episode. It was a lot of fun to record with Mike. So I think you'll enjoy this. By the way, make sure you jump in and grab the LifeCon early bird rate. So remember, that's going to end really, really soon. It's going to end July 15th. So if you want to save $100 and be one of the 70 people at LifeCon 2017, then go to Best LifeCon Ever. Thank you for listening to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. Mike, welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors.
Thanks, Jamie. Looking forward to another great episode.
Always, always, always love having you back on the show. And we've been talking about a lot of great things lately. And this is something that we've come back to over and over. It's a common thread. It's actually one of the requirements that we talk about in running a successful chiropractic business. And, you've been saying this forever. When we look at the four different requirements, whether it be, leadership, team, we recognize that this is one that probably, you can make the case. It's tough because the four of them are very important, but you can make the case that this is the most important one, Mike.
I think so. And if I can I let the cat out of the bag?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So that requirement is communication. And it was something that, when we were really thinking, we had a pretty long list. I remember, Jamie, when we were trying to, put together and trying to brainstorm, okay, what are the requirements to be a really successful chiropractor? And we had a pretty long list. And of course, we wanted to bring it down into, manageable categories. But this one was really, I kept pushing for this. And this one was kind of the one that I felt then, and I still feel now is likely the most important one. And you're right, it is hard to kind of put that label on any one of them because that's why they're labeled requirements. They're all necessary. But I know for me, really when I really developed my communication abilities and my skills, that's when my practice took off. And along with that, now that we've been working with clients for years now, that's obviously one of the biggest pitfalls or requirement that people are lacking, other docs are lacking, and is really holding them back as far as the success and growth of their practice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I know for me, not having many of the other requirements, in terms of systems specifically, and, even team, not having those in place, but having strong communication, I was able to grow a successful practice. And it's only since, adding the other ones that things have developed. But, I look at this as almost the saving grace for me. And I think that just reinforces the concept that this is probably, at least in my experience, the most important one. And, I think something that's interesting to consider is, even in chiropractic, because we hear this from the stage and lots of people talk about communication and, being great at communicating chiropractic. But I think in a lot of cases, what passes as, good or even great communication in chiropractic, based on what I've seen, I would still consider it fairly mediocre and middle of the road, just enough to, get the basic points across. I think that as a profession, I think like almost every requirement we've dug into, I think, we could set the ceiling a lot higher in this area for sure.
I think so. And, as you were saying that, it's really interesting that you brought up the point about yourself. Of course, as I've said many times, I know you are the best communicator of chiropractic that I've heard for sure. And so it's interesting that you say that and that maybe that's why I was pushing so hard for it, because I wasn't a great communicator when I started. Maybe that's where your hesitancy was, is because you were such you were and are such a great communicator. So that's really interesting that you bring that up now. But I remember back, and it was just all about scripts, right? I remember first being in practice, and at the time, I know my the scripting that I followed, or the person that I really followed a lot early in practice, was Bill Esteb. And Bill is, he's a very insightful guy and very smart guy. But really, all I was doing is using a lot of the scripts that he had come up with, and that's all they were. I wasn't necessarily communicating; I was regurgitating scripts that Bill Esteb had come up with.
Yeah, and I read Bill's stuff. I think he's solid. And there's so many. I know you've coached with other people prior to developing your practice, and always being prepared is something that I think has helped you get by. But again, developing this area takes more than just being prepared, right? I mean, that's one of the categories, and we'll talk about that today. And it's great to have frameworks. I wouldn't say I don't like scripts, because I think there's a lot of value in having a set of words. I like the concept of frameworks. I love the idea of having I think about in terms of, having a book, but what you really have are these chapter titles. And then within each chapter are the different pieces, and those change between practitioners. So the way you, Mike, would communicate something on day one, although our chapter title might be the same as we go through, connecting with somebody or having a consult, or, specific questions we're going to ask. But within that, and this is what makes you now a great communicator, is within those chapters, you have your own stories in there, right? You have your own experiences in there. You have your own communication strategies inside each chapter. So, I think that the preparation is great, and having frameworks is great. But again, going from good to great and mediocre to extraordinary goes so far beyond, just having those labels. So what we've done today, guys, is broke this down into 3 segments. And we've already talked at length about the importance of mindset in terms of communication. We've specifically been talking about mindset in terms of sales lately, but really communication is the bigger theme when you think about selling. Selling is one piece of communication, but communication is, the bigger requirement. And mindset obviously is a big part of that, and self-esteem plays a role in there. But, the other 2 pieces are being prepared, as Mike said today. And then the final piece, which we'll spend some time on today, and I think this is, a piece that never gets considered in a lot of businesses and chiropractic especially, but, when to apply it. And that's the concept, right, of having the chapters, but also having the stories and the strategies within each one. So, Mike, let's start off with talking about, being prepared. You talked about frameworks and scripts, and, first off, how do people get this? I know when I came out of school, you talked about following Bill Esteb, and maybe it's as simple as that, but when I came out of school, I didn't have a clue. I had no idea what I was supposed to do or say. For me, I think the reason it ended up working out is I had an idea of where I wanted to take people, but it probably would have been helpful for me to have a little bit of framework before I actually had to kind of figure it out all on my own. So where do people go? What do they look for? How do they gather some of this framework?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, there's lots of different resources out there. For example, yourself, you've recorded several podcast episodes that are inclusive of all sorts of different communication strategies. I'm sure there are strategies that we're sharing on each and every episode here and there. So, of course, the podcast here would be a great resource, Bill. There's so many people out there, and there's so many. I think most chiropractors, don't lack for scripts and frameworks. There's just so much out there, but it's really this next step that I think is most important, is then taking those and making them their own. Right. So I think that's where we all need to start. And Jamie, you came up with a great idea of the communication tool. I'll let you describe that more in a minute. But I think what we need to do first is start to just compile somewhere. And this is another aside. One of the biggest skills I think that goes, undiscussed for any entrepreneur is just having some type of system to, capture information. We oftentimes have all these great ideas in our mind, and in this example, we all often have these great ways. You're at a conference and you hear someone, communicate some little aspect or share some little principle. You're like, wow, that was awesome. That was so good. But I think what a lot of us do or a lot of us are lacking is that, and might sound weird describing it this way, but we're lacking that skill to actually, take information that we hear and compile it in a way and in a place that we can actually access it and then use it. Same for like reading books. We all tend to read books and read. But I think, a skill that's often overlooked is that ability then to take that information and put it somewhere and then have some type of a action step so that we can actually use that information. And so I got off on a little tangent, but I think that's important, and it comes back to this idea of the communication tool, is that, we need to, whether it's, things that we've developed ourselves, these little communication strategies or frameworks as you've described them, or if it's something that we heard someone on the stage or maybe on this podcast, but we need to first, create a way and a place to put all this information so that we can actually access it, but also to refine it and improve upon it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And another thing I learned from you and leveraging the technology that's available. You think back to even 10 years ago, you'd go to a conference or a seminar and you'd leave with a big stack of notes. And of course, those notes end up being filed somewhere. And I'm sure many docs listening in have many, many booklets that have been filed somewhere. And, even when people come to our live training, I always think of LifeCon, we have this amazing, book that we've created for people every year. And we still encourage people to take what they write down in that book, distill it down to, really one or two or three at the most really important pieces, and then to take that and put it somewhere. Right, that has to get stored somewhere, and I don't think the book is probably the best place to put it, or paper. So, using things like Evernote. I know you're a big fan of Evernote in terms of being able to document a lot of these things. But the tool you're talking about, Mike, is the communication tool. And guys, what we'll do is we'll actually include that in the show notes for you. You can just go in and click it and download that. So the communication tool, by the way, it'll be lifebydesignforchiropractors.com/podcast. Find today's episode, jump in there, grab the communication tool. So this is something that we put together after working with lots of clients and realizing exactly this, that they had nowhere to put these pieces of information into. And specifically when it came to communication. So, they might have an Evernote document with a little bit of a day one, or they might have, something in an app with, a couple important points that they heard on, say, our podcast. But then for me, I wanted something where it was, I could click a tab and see, all right, case review. I could click a tab and see what are the notes from a review of results or an annual, conversation, whatever those are. And so this communication tool, and this is how we advise you use it, but you're going to be compiling essentially notes from all these different visits, whether it be a progress examination follow-up, a re-examination follow-up, annuals, end of corrective care, whatever it is. The point is we want to have those isolated into one specific area with, just with the click of a button, you can go and see that. And, I think of the value, for example, Mike, with yourself and my team, we have just that. We have a team. We have associate doctors. And, we have this unified document where, if I make a change, say, to the case review, or if one of our doctors has an experience and we want to add that as another tool in the repertoire, I'll say, hey, guys, add that to the case review or add that to the PE follow-up. And we know that we're compiling this comprehensive database of options, if you will. It's almost like, we've talked about it before, it's almost like a playbook. And this is what I love about it, is it really is our office's playbook for all these important pieces of the puzzle. So, Mike, you had some really, I think, helpful tips on how you would use this tool. So when docs download this, what's your advice on how to implement this?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to go in and start to complete it, of course, and just start to fill it out with some of those things. And, I think about, I think if you've been in practice any any amount of time, you've already started to kind of have your go-to kind of analogies and stories and ways of explaining things. So I think I would definitely just start there. And then once you've kind of filled out a little bit in each of the different visits in this document, then what I would do is start to go back and then really give it some thought, because I think a lot of times what happens is we get into these, almost this robotic way where we just kind of, it's kind of always how I've said it, without really stopping to take the time to really think that through. And I think that's where this becomes so valuable. Is that, the reality is this, is that, you mentioned this off the top, is that when I guarantee everyone listening has been into an office, maybe you're shadowing someone or you heard someone from the stage and they've shared their report of findings with you, and you're like, your mouth hits the floor, like you said that to somebody, like that's your report, or that's something that you actually say to someone in that situation, and you're just blown away by it. So you mentioned off the beginning, but who you are as a person, your self-esteem, your confidence, your belief in what you're doing, of course, is number one. But number two, and like we've been saying, is being prepared. And that's what this is all about. It's being prepared. So the first step, I think, is getting your ideas down, the things that you typically say now, or maybe going through some of those old notebooks from seminars and times when you've heard things that you really liked, and just starting to kind of compile it, making it a really big long list of all the different ways that you can communicate different things in your practice. And then from there, I think the next step is actually using, spending some time thinking about these things and really, understanding where, each one of these visits falls in the big picture. And then most importantly, from there, really trying to put yourself in the, the shoes of the person you're talking to, in the patient's shoes, and like, where are they at? At this point, what do they understand? What do they need to understand? Where are they in this process, in your lifetime care map? And then really starting to refine these notes and starting to kind of whittle it down and deleting and adding and really spending some time on it. This is important. It's a requirement. And I think if you really want to become a super successful chiropractor, you really need to own this. So I think the first step is, just throwing a ton of stuff down on paper and then spending some time to really think through each of these things versus just, I heard that sounds kind of cool, but maybe it sounds kind of cool, but in the context of what you do in your practice, your brand, your message, it doesn't fit. So I think it's first just taking the time to really think all of these strategies and frameworks to, and whittle it down to your unique communication framework.
Well, and it's a great starting point. And guys, once you start doing this and you get this all documented, of course, you're going to be having these visits. You're going to be doing a day one. You're going to be doing a review of results, and so on and so forth. I think it just makes sense that when it's fresh, right? You walk out of the room, you have a couple minutes, you think, man, I nailed that one. That was right on the money. Go back through, maybe there's a couple things you want to add in, or maybe it was a huge disaster. Go back, revisit that, add some notes in there. So, make it a regular part of your routine, no matter where you are, whether you're a great communicator, we're still adding and deleting and refining our communication tool. If you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're newer to this, if you're new in practice or you're just struggling with communication, this should almost be a daily, at least at minimum, a weekly event where you're going in and you're taking time each day or each week to update this and modify it. And just that alone is going to make this more conscious to you anyway, and you're going to be thinking about it more, which I think is going to be a huge benefit. At the end of this, you're going to end up with this ongoing playbook of all these different options where, again, you're Tom Brady, you're up at the line of scrimmage, the defense calls an audible. You have to know what play to run. And, that brings us to the third piece of the puzzle. And I think this is just so overlooked. And this is what I was getting at before when I said, lots of scripts exist. And, there's a lot of, average to slightly above average communication in the profession. But what makes your communication different, what makes you a communication master, is your ability to recognize where that person sitting across from you is. What's the buyer's journey? What's their psychology? How does what you're saying lead them down that path? Do you know where you're trying to take them? My purpose on day one is not to build a lifetime practice member. My purpose on day one is to create some curiosity. My purpose on day one is to get them to say yes to the examination. And so there's an objective every single step of the way. And once you understand that, and this is where the skill comes in. right? This is where the exciting stuff comes in. This is where you start to develop, mastery. So when you look at this, Mike, I know you've trained a lot of your associates, and again, we're doing the same thing. Would you say that this is probably the biggest challenge that exists in docs across the board, especially in terms of communication?
Yeah, it's knowing what to say when. It's knowing, to really deeply understand, like you said, the psychology of the person that you're communicating to, and then being able to dip into that playbook and just pick the perfect play for that situation. And I think that's really where the mastery comes in. I think for me, that's what defines a master when it comes to communication, is saying the exact right thing in the exact right situation. And it's something that, when you think about, in that situation, you can't stall, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we talked about, again, I keep coming back to this idea of confidence and self-esteem. I mean, if you're sitting there and someone, asks you a question, or someone comes up with an objection, it's not just about saying the right thing, and it's about saying it with confidence. And if you sit there and stall, and you've heard a lot of people say, well, listen, when someone asks you a question in that situation, or in any situation in practice, you shouldn't just act like a know-it-all and off the top of your head, just start spitting out this answer. You want to just pause for a second, and you want to be thoughtful about it. And you want to show that you're not this know-it-all, that you're actually considering what they said, and you're trying to come up with a unique answer for them. So I'm not you want to respond confidently, but you want to do it in a way where I think we've all been there. And actually, Jamie, is one of the things that came up several times in that in our recent survey when we asked docs about what it was about sales that really turned them off. And really, where they really struggled when it comes to sales in their practice. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came up several times is that I don't always know what to say in that moment. Like I hesitate, I stall, I'm uncertain. And of course, the person across from them can sense that. They can right away. When they start to stall, it's just like that moment of uncertainty, and they pick up on it. And as soon as you stall and then uncertainty shows through, you're done. Right? You've lost the confidence. You've lost their trust. So that's really where the preparation is so important. It's being super confident, having great self-esteem, a belief in what you're doing. Step one. Step two, being prepared. Writing down and having answers to all the questions that you might be asked, all the most typical objections, what you are going to communicate in a report, et cetera, in this communication tool. Being prepared, but then of course being able to, as you said, identify the situation, identify who's in front of you, and then pick the perfect play for every situation. That's what becoming a master is all about, and it really does take all three of these steps to really succeed at that.
I think this is where the failure ends up happening in a lot of practices. And when we did the survey, it just reinforced that when people would say, well, I don't know what to say. And it's not because there's a shortage of scripts, as we said. It's not because there's a shortage of things to say. So it's not just learning another script. It's not just, and again, we should build a robust playbook. You should have lots of options. You should know what those are. But again, it's not just about memorizing those and regurgitating those. Where the real mastery comes in is in the final piece, and that's knowing how to apply them, knowing where the person is. And you said this earlier, I think it bears repeating, but knowing what your brand is, knowing what your own lexicon is, knowing what your market is. We've said this numerous times, but what you could say in your practice and what I might say in my practice are different. But heck, what we would say in our practice compared to some of our American clients, what they might say in their practice is extremely different. And again, that just, comes back to the market and understanding that. So if you really want to, be in a position where you feel like you can adapt to every situation, where you're leading somebody, you never end up essentially with the deer in headlights look sitting across from somebody on day one or day two, then this is the process you need to go down. And it's not just, on your chiropractic sales process. This is just communication. And, it's at the table, it's at a workshop, it's out at a screening event or a public community outreach program. Whatever it is, this is the process. It's having the mindset and the self-esteem, knowing the plays in your playbook, and then knowing people and really getting to understand people in your market and just people in general, and knowing, what they need to hear from you in order to move them along. And that's not necessarily in a manipulative type way. It's truly taking the time to study and become a master in understanding people, to apply what it is that you have to lead them to this future benefit. And that's what we've talked. It's Dan Sullivan's strategic codes, right? The future benefit that they're going to get, that's what you're selling them on, and you're getting them to engage in taking action. So this template goes beyond, as I said, day 1, day 2. It's every part of your life. But what we've done for LifeCon specifically is we've tailored this to the chiropractic sales process. So we're excited about this. There's nothing like this in the profession. This has not been done before, and that's why we've purposely changed the setup and the framework for LifeCon, because we realize that this is something that's missing. Our surveys reinforce that. If you're listening, I know that you know that this is missing. It's part of why you listen to the podcast, to get that information. So make sure you take a chance. Come to LifeCon. It's not only an amazing experience from building relationships, but the sales training that you're going to get is like nothing else. We're going to be unveiling the sales mindset, the sales playbook, and we're going to be practicing the sales process. So September 16th, 17th, Toronto, Ontario, easy to get to. We'll put the link in here, but it's bestlifeconever.com. Also, make sure you download the communication tool. That'll be in the show notes, Life by Design for chiropractors.com/podcast. And thank you for listening to Life by Design, the voice of reason in chiropractic.